In the soft glow of a single candle, shadows dance against the quiet walls of Street Mary Mead. A peaceful night hides an unsettling secret. As the flame flickers, mystery awakens. Miss Marple and Sherlock Holmes are about to uncover a truth darker than the night itself. A single candle burns in the pond. Quiet village of Street Mary Mead, its trembling flame casting long, uneasy shadows across the room. Outside, the night is too still, almost as if it is holding its breath. Moments later, a desperate knock shatters the silence, pulling Miss Marple from her thoughts. The visitor's face is pale, his words broken by fear, and before dawn he will be dead. When Sherlock Holmes arrives to investigate, he finds clues far too intricate for coincidence. Something hidden, powerful, and dangerous has found its way into this peaceful village, and it is only just beginning. Chapter 1. The Stranger. In the candlelight. The candle on Miss Marple's small oak table flickered gently, its flame bending like a timid dancer as the cold night pressed against the windows. Outside, Street Mary Mead slept under a veil of fog, its narrow lanes silent, its cottages appearing like shadows folded into shadows. The air carried a deep stillness, the kind that made even time hesitate. Most nights in the village passed peacefully, but tonight something felt unsettled. Miss Marple, wrapped in a soft lavender shawl, sat knitting near the hearth. Though her hands moved with familiar calm, her eyes occasionally drifted toward the window. "The mist has come early," she murmured to herself, noting how it clung to the glass like pale fingers. She had lived long enough to know that such nights carried secrets. They always had. Just as she finished the row of her knitting, a faint sound tugged at her attention, a distant shuffle, almost like hurried footsteps muffled by the damp ground. She paused. Her hearing, surprisingly sharp for her age, detected a strange irregularity in the sounds, a hesitation, then quick movement, then silence. She set her knitting aside and waited. And then it came, a knock, a desperate, uneven, trembling knock. Miss Marple stiffened slightly. Visitors rarely came at such an hour unless something was dreadfully wrong. She rose from her chair with slow, careful steps and moved toward the door, her hand tightening around the brass knob. "Who is?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "Please, open, for God's sake, open the door." The voice was a man's, strained, breathless, and soaked in fear. Miss Marple hesitated only a moment before unlocking the door. When it swung open, a gust of cold air rushed inside, carrying with it fog, damp leaves, and the trembling figure of a stranger. He was young, perhaps in his late 30s, but exhaustion had carved harsh lines across his face. His coat was torn, his shoes muddy, and his hands shook violently as if he had run from something he could not outrun. "You must help me," he whispered, collapsing onto the threshold. Miss Marple acted quickly, supporting him with surprising strength and guiding him inside. She set him near the fire, wrapped him in an extra blanket, and placed a warm cup of tea between his trembling hands. "Now, then," she said gently, "take a breath, dear. Tell me what has frightened you so terribly." The man swallowed hard. His eyes darted toward the window as though expecting someone or something to appear from the dark. "They followed me," he whispered, "all the way from London. I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Who followed you?" "Them," he said. "The men who will kill me." Miss Marple felt a chill climb up her spine, though her face remained composed. "You're safe here, my dear, but I cannot help you unless you explain." The man nodded shakily. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper so thin she almost missed it. "I have information," he said. "Dangerous information. I was carrying it for a friend, someone who trusted me. But he's dead now, and I'm next." Miss Marple remained silent, letting him speak at his own pace. "They want the papers back," he continued, "and they will do anything to get them. I hid them, but I fear they already know where." Miss Marple's sharp mind caught the implied message instantly. He did not trust the police. He trusted a stranger in a village instead. That meant the matter was bigger, far bigger than a simple robbery or personal threat. Suddenly, the man clutched his chest. The teacup fell from his hand, shattering on the carpet. "No, no, not now," he gasped. Miss Marple rushed toward him, but before she could reach him, he collapsed onto the floor. His breathing grew shallow, his lips turned pale, and in his final moment of strength, he grabbed her wrist and pushed a small folded slip of paper into her palm. "Hide this," he rasped. "Find him. Whole mess." And then his hand fell limp. The room fell silent, deathly silent, except for the soft hiss of the candle's flame. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her heart heavy. She had seen death before, but never one so sudden, so panic-stricken, so tightly woven with the threads of danger. She slowly opened the slip of paper. Inside was a single line of handwriting. "The truth lies beneath the Sassa's quietest places." Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. She looked toward the window, where the fog pressed thicker than before. Someone was out there. Someone who had followed him. Someone who might return. Without wasting another second, Miss Marple extinguished the candle. The house fell into darkness, and for the first time in many years, Miss Marple felt the cold breath of a mystery unfolding right at her doorstep, a mystery she could not solve alone. She would need help, and she knew exactly whom to call. Morning light struggled to break through the dense fog that lingered over Street Mary Mead. The small village seemed muted, as though it had absorbed the shock of the previous night. Miss Marple stood beside her parlour window, gazing at the empty lane where the stranger had last staggered in the darkness. She held the folded paper he had given her, its cryptic message, echoing in her thoughts. The police had arrived at dawn, summoned discreetly. Inspector Graves, a stout man with a permanently puzzled expression, examined the body with care but with obvious confusion. "Natural causes, perhaps," he muttered, scratching his head. "A heart attack from fright." Miss Marple did not argue. There was nothing natural about the way his eyes had widened before death, nor about the strange bruise near his collarbone. But Inspector Graves was not the man she needed. No, she needed someone capable of seeing what others overlooked, which was why, at precisely 9 o'clock, she made the most unusual phone call of her life. And that afternoon, a tall figure stepped out of a hired cab and onto the cobblestone path outside her cottage. Miss Marple opened the door and greeted him with a polite nod. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said. Holmes bowed, slightly, his sharp grey eyes already sweeping across the garden, the windows, the ground, absorbing details like pages of a book. "Miss Marple," he replied, "your message was intriguing. Thank you for coming on such short notice. When an elderly woman from a quiet village requests my presence regarding a mysterious death," Holmes said, "I consider it an invitation to something far more complex than it appears." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. How perceptive. Holmes stepped inside without further prompting, immediately surveying the room. He paused beside the exact spot where the stranger had collapsed. "This is where he died?" "Yes." Holmes knelt, examining the carpet fibers, the overturned teacup, the faint disturbance in the dust near the baseboard. "There was a struggle," he murmured. He tried to stand twice. He fell here, then finally here. Miss Marple watched with quiet admiration. She had pieced together the same conclusions through domestic intuition. Holmes reached them through scientific deduction. They were different, yet startlingly similar. Holmes stood and faced her. "You mentioned a message?" Miss Marple handed him the slip of paper. Holmes unfolded it carefully, reading the line aloud. "The truth lies beneath the quietest places." Holmes's eyes narrowed. Symbolic, possibly literal, possibly both. He looked at her sharply. "You have not shown this to the police, I presume?" "Certainly not," Miss Marple replied. Inspector Graves would only assume the poor man was poetic. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile, a fair assessment. Miss Marple motioned toward the window. "Mr. Holmes, do you believe he was followed here?" "I do not merely believe it," Holmes said quietly. "I am certain of it." Miss Marple's breath caught. "Did you find something outside?" Holmes stepped closer to the window, tapping the glass lightly with a gloved finger. "Two sets of footprints approach your door. Only one set leaves." Miss Marple's heart skipped. "Then, the killer was here last night?" Holmes nodded, and he waited, in the fog, watching your house, even after the man collapsed. He turned to face her, his expression grave. "You are fortunate he did not enter." Miss Marple steadied herself, her voice calm but firm. "Fortunate and aware. That is why I called you." Holmes looked impressed. Most would have panicked. "You prepared?" Miss Marple raised her chin slightly. "One does not reach my age without learning a few things about danger." Holmes's expression softened, just slightly, with newfound respect. Before either could continue, a shadow appeared outside her, figure moving deliberately, confidently along the garden path. Holmes noticed instantly. He touched a finger to his lips, signaling silence. The knock came not frantic like before, but crisp, official and cold. Holmes whispered, "We are being watched, Miss Marple, and possibly tested." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Shall I answer it?" Holmes nodded. Carefully, she opened the door to find a man in a dark coat and bowler hat, holding a small leather notebook. "Good afternoon," he said politely. "I am here on behalf of a gentleman who is deeply concerned about the safety of this village." He smiled, but his eyes did not. "I was told a stranger visited you last night." Miss Marple felt Holmes move behind her, silent as a shadow. "Yes," she replied calmly. "A traveller. He passed away shortly after arriving." The man tilted his head. "So unfortunate. And he did not leave anything behind? No papers, no belongings, no messages? My employer is most anxious to recover something he believes was stolen." Miss Marple's heartbeat quickened, but her expression did not. Holmes stepped into view. "And who," he asked coolly, "is your employer?" The man froze. He had not expected Sherlock Holmes. He swallowed, forced a smile, tipped his hat, and stepped back. "A misunderstanding, I'm sure. Good day." And without another word, he vanished into the fog. Holmes shut the door firmly. Miss Marple turned to him. "They already know." Holmes nodded gravely. "Yes, which means, Miss Marple, we must find the truth before they find us." Chapter 2. Beneath the Quiet Places. The fog did not lift quickly that day. It clung to Street Mary Mead like a secret it refused to release, soft and white and strangely heavy. The villagers moved about their routines with muted energy, hanging laundry, exchanging short greetings, sweeping front steps. But even from her window, Miss Marple could tell, news had already begun to travel. In a village like Street Mary Mead, nothing stayed quiet for long, except, perhaps, the most dangerous things. Sherlock Holmes sat at Miss Marple's small table, long fingers resting lightly on the slip of paper. The words on it seemed to weigh more than ink should. The truth lies beneath the quietest places. He had read the line several times now, yet with each reading it seemed to rearrange itself in his mind, hinting at a different angle. "We must begin by asking," Holmes said finally, "what counts as a quiet place in a village that is already quiet by nature?" Miss Marple poured him a second cup of tea, her movements unhurried. "There are degrees of quiet, Mr. Holmes. Street Mary Mead may look calm, but some corners are more overlooked than others." Holmes glanced at her. "Such as?" "The churchyard, for one," she replied, "especially the older part where the ivy has been allowed to grow, little-used footpaths behind the vicarage garden, and, of course," she paused, knitting her thoughts together, "the library." Holmes nodded slightly. "You mentioned in your letter that the stranger looked particularly toward the church as he arrived." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Even in his fear, he noticed it. People in distress often look instinctively toward the place that matters to them, or toward where they believe help or danger lies." Holmes rose, adjusting his coat. "Then we shall start there. The vicarage garden, churchyard, and the library. 3 possible quiet places. And the vicar? Miss Marple added gently. He does like to be involved in anything that smells even faintly of drama. If we do not visit him, he will simply come to us with half the story twisted by village imagination. Holmes gave a faint, amused exhale. Then perhaps we can save ourselves the trouble and intercept the imagination at its source. They left the cottage together, stepping into the mist-wreathed lane. Holmes's tall figure and Miss Marple's modest one made an unusual pair, yet they walked in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. As they passed Mrs. Hartleyridge's cottage, a curtain twitched. At the corner near the post office, Mr. Jenkins pretended to rearrange newspapers he had already tidied twice. By the time they reached the vicarage gate, half the village had seen them and would soon be talking about them. The vicarage garden was, as ever, neatly kept. Bare rose bushes, trimmed hedges, and a small stone bench near the old yew tree. The botting vicar, Reverend Leonard Ames, stood near the back, talking to his wife, who wore an expression that hovered between worry and curiosity. "Ah, Miss Marple," the vicar called out, straightening his cassock. "We've heard the most disquieting news." "I rather thought you might," Miss Marple replied. "Kindly, Vicar, Mrs. Ames, may I introduce Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" The vicar blinked, then nearly dropped the small gardening knife in his hand. "Sherlock? Holmes? The Sherlock Holmes? The name has served me well so far," Holmes said dryly. "Oh, how extraordinary!" Mrs. Ames exclaimed. "In our little village. Oh, Leonard, do offer him a seat or tea or something. One can't have a world-famous detective standing about like a parcel." Holmes declined the offer of tea with a courteous gesture. "I do not wish to take much of your time, Reverend. I only have a few questions about last night." The vicar's expression sobered. "Yes, terrible business. We saw the constable's lanterns when they took the poor fellow's body away." "You did not see him arrive?" Holmes asked. The vicar shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not. My wife and I retired rather early. The fog was thick, and we heard very little. Although," Holmes pounced gently. "Although? Well," the vicar said, glancing toward the back of the garden, "around 11, there was a sound from the churchyard, a sort of scraping. I assumed it was a cat, or perhaps the old gate shifting. It can be quite noisy in damp weather." "Did you investigate?" Holmes's tone was neutral. The vicar hesitated. "No, I prayed that it was nothing important and stayed in bed." Mrs. Ames sniffed. "He is not as brave as he looks on Sundays." Miss Marple's eyes had already shifted to the yew tree and the low stone wall. Beyond it, behind which lay the older part of the churchyard, it was shaded, slightly darker, and more forgotten. The quietest place, perhaps, in all of Street Mary Mead. Holmes followed her gaze. "May we look around the grounds, Reverend?" Of course," the vicar said eagerly. "If there's anything at all we can do." Holmes and Miss Marple moved toward the rear, their steps slow and attentive. As they reached the wall, Holmes paused and crouched down, fingers brushing along the damp stone. "There," he murmured. Near the base of the wall, the moss and earth were slightly disturbed. Not dramatically so, just a faint, narrow streak where something had been dragged or pushed aside. Holmes ran his finger along it, then brought it to his nose, inhaling faintly. "Metal," he said, "and soil, recently disturbed. Someone pulled something out from under this wall." "Or pushed something in," Miss Marple countered gently. Holmes's eyes flicked to her. Indeed, they stepped over into the churchyard. The older graves here were worn and crooked, names smoothed away by time. Ivy clung to the stones like whispers. The fog made everything seem closer, more intimate, as though the dead might be listening. Miss Marple's gaze moved carefully from grave to grave, from stone to stone. She had walked this path countless times in all weathers, for funerals, for comfort, for quiet thought. Today, however, she looked with new purpose. "Mr. Holmes," she said softly, "do you notice that one?" He followed her line of sight. One grave, near the back, had a peculiarity. Where the others were damp and dark, this one's soil looked slightly fresher, the grass atop it speckled with disturbed earth, not newly dug, but recently interfered with. Holmes approached, studied the ground, then looked at the stone. The name, though faded, was still legible. Edward Price. 1873. 1929. Be still and know. Holmes murmured the epitaph under his breath. Be still and know. His eyes sharpened. Another reference to quietness. Miss Marple's voice dropped. The truth lies beneath the quietest places. Holmes knelt and pressed his hand flat against the earth. After a moment, he nodded. There is something here, not deep shallow enough that one could retrieve it quickly. And yet, Miss Marple said, who would dare disturb a grave in a village where everyone watches everyone? Holmes stood, his gaze drifting past the vicarage toward the village beyond. Someone who believed the risk worth taking. Someone who knew precisely what was buried here. Miss Marple folded her hands. Or someone who put it there in the first place. Holmes gave a clear, faint, approving smile. Miss Marple, I begin to see why you invited me. Before she could respond, the sound of footsteps on gravel approached. They turned to see Constable Davies hurrying up the path, his helmet slightly askew, his expression flustered. Miss Marple, Mr. Holmes, he puffed. You're needed at once. There's been some trouble at the library. Holmes and Miss Marple exchanged a glance. The library, she repeated softly. Another quiet place. Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. Then it would seem our enemy prefers silence but makes a great deal of noise, trying to maintain it. They followed the constable back through the fog, leaving behind the disturbed grave and the whispering epitaph. The Street Mary Mead Library was a modest building, red brick, ivy trailing along its sides, a small bell above the door that chimed gently whenever someone entered. It was rarely crowded. Villagers came for gardening books, old novels, and the occasional travel guide they would never truly use. It was, in many respects, exactly the sort of place a stranger might choose if he wanted to vanish into stillness. But today, the quiet had been disrupted. As Holmes and Miss Marple stepped inside, they immediately sensed it. Not the usual hush of turning pages and soft footsteps, but a strained silence, the kind that hangs after something has shattered. The head librarian, Mr. Harold Finch, stood near the front desk, pale and sweating. His thin hair was in disarray, and one of his sleeves was torn. His glasses hung askew, as though recently knocked aside. "Oh, Miss Marple," he gasped. "This is all very irregular, very shocking, very—" He fluttered his hands helplessly. "Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said soothingly, "take a breath. The S. Books aren't on fire, so things cannot be entirely hopeless." Holmes stepped past them, his eyes already scanning. Several shelves near the back appeared slightly out of order. A small step stool lay overturned, and a stack of reference books had fallen to the floor. Constable Davies cleared his throat. "Mr. Finch says someone broke in early this morning." "Not broke exactly," Finch corrected nervously. "The door was unlocked, but I know I locked it last night. I always lock it. I double-check, triple-check sometimes." "And what exactly is missing?" Holmes asked. Finch swallowed. "At first I didn't think anything was. Just some books out of place, very frustrating. But then I saw the cabinet." He pointed toward a tall wooden cabinet with glass doors, set slightly apart from the regular shelves. Its lock was broken. The door stood ajar. Holmes approached, his sharp gaze, noting the fresh splinters near the lock. "What was kept here?" "Old records," Finch said. "Parish registries, local land deeds, documents from before the war. Hardly the sort of thing a common thief would care for." "Not common," Holmes murmured. "Not at all." Miss Marple stepped beside him, peering at the sparse remaining folders. "Is anything specific missing, Mr. Finch?" "Yes, one folder." Finch wrung his hands. "The set of documents pertaining to the Stroud estate." Holmes looked up sharply. "Stroud?" "Yes," Finch said. "The old property on the edge of the village. It's been empty for years. Used to be quite grand before it fell in disrepair. The family line died out, as far as anyone knows. Miss Marple's eyes clouded thoughtfully. Stroud Estate, that's near the old quarry road, isn't it? Very quiet, very rarely visited. Another quiet place, Holmes said under his breath. Miss Marple lowered her voice. Mr. Holmes, do you think the stranger's information had something to do with land? It is entirely possible, Holmes replied. Land is power, Miss Marple. Strategic land, even more so. A seemingly worthless estate in the countryside might be worth quite a bit to the right kind of men. Holmes turned abruptly to Finch. Who knew those records existed? Well, anyone with a serious interest in local history, I suppose, the librarian said weakly. The vicar, perhaps. Some of the older villagers, a few outsiders over the years, asking about genealogies and such. Outsiders? Holmes's voice sharpened. Recently? Finch bit his lip, thinking, yes, about 3 weeks ago. A gentleman from London, very well dressed, very polite. He spent a long time with the land records, asked particularly about unused properties, especially the Stroud estate. Did he give a name? Holmes asked. Yes, I remember, because it sounded official. He signed the visitor log as Mr. Grayson. Holmes filed the name away in his mind, though he doubted it was real. While he questioned Finch further, Miss Marple quietly drifted towards the Ote, disturbed shelves. Her eyes skimmed titles almost unconsciously. Local flora, railway timetables, county gazetteers, European trade routes. She paused. On one shelf, tucked almost out of sight, lay a small, slim volume that seemed oddly out of place among the local history books. Introduction to Basic Cryptography. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. Holmes noticed. You have found something? Perhaps, she said, handing him the book. It seems our little library has expanded its interests. Holmes flipped through it quickly. Inside the front cover was a small handwritten note. Loaned by special request. Not for general circulation. H.F. Mr. Finch, Holmes called. Who requested this book? Finch adjusted his glasses, squinting. Oh, that one. It was requested by the same man, the London gentleman, Mr. Grayson. He asked if we had anything on ciphers, codes, that sort of thing. I told him we didn't, but he left an address and requested that if a book came available, I have it set aside. And did it? Holmes asked. Yes, quite coincidentally, Finch said. A few days later, a box of donated books arrived from a retired schoolmaster. This volume was in it. I put it aside, but the gentleman never returned. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the slip of paper Holmes still held. The stranger who died in my cottage spoke of dangerous information. He carried a cryptic message. Another man studied land records, ciphers, and unused estates. She clasped her hands together. It begins to form a pattern, does it not? Holmes's eyes flashed. Yes, our enemies are planning something that requires secrecy, land, and precise timing. And your village, Miss Marple, is at the center of it. Finch sagged into a chair. But what could anyone want with an old estate and some dusty papers? Holmes looked toward the fog outside the window. That, Mr. Finch, is what we must discover, quickly. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm, before someone else dies. There was a brief, heavy silence. Then Constable Davies cleared his throat. Should we, perhaps, post a guard here, or at Miss Marple's cottage? Holmes nodded. A guard at both would be prudent, but do not advertise it loudly. These men operate in shadows. We shall force them to remain in them. Miss Marple looked at him curiously. What do you propose next, Mr. Holmes? He turned to her, eyes fierce with purpose. We visit the Stroud estate, Miss Marple, before nightfall. Her hands tightened around the handle of her handbag. The thought of that lonely, decaying house at the edge of the village, wrapped in fog and silence, sent a faint shiver through her. But her voice did not tremble when she answered, Then we had better not waste any daylight. They stepped out of the library together into the waiting mist. Behind them, the bell above the door chimed once, a small, fragile sound in a village where the quiet was beginning to crack. Chapter 3. The House at the Edge of the Fog. The road to the Stroud estate wound away from Street Mary Mead like a ribbon of forgotten intention, narrowing gradually as it left the warmth of the village behind. Fields faded into scrub, hedges grew wild, and the mist deepened until it seemed they were walking inside a cloud. Miss Marple walked with careful steps beside Sherlock Holmes, her sensible shoes crunching lightly on the gravel. Holmes, hands clasped behind his back, moved with that long, measured stride of his, as though even the fog were something to be examined and understood. "Very few people come this way now," Miss Marple remarked quietly. "Not since the last of the Stroud family died. Some say the house is haunted." Holmes gave a faint exhale that might have been amusement. "Ghosts, Miss Marple, tend to serve as very convenient disguises for the living." "Yes," she replied mildly, "especially for those who do not wish to be disturbed." As they crested a small rise, the house came into view at last. The Stroud estate loomed out of the mist, a broad, grey stone manor that had once aspired to grandeur. Now its windows were dark, some shuttered, others cracked. Ivy clung stubbornly to the walls, crawling into broken mortar and around old iron gutters. Several roof tiles were missing, and a chimney leaned slightly off true, like a tired old man who had given up on standing straight. No smoke rose from the chimneys, no light showed behind the épée glass. And yet, Holmes slowed. "You notice it too?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Yes," he said. "For a house long abandoned, the grounds are not as wild as they should be. The path is partially cleared. Those branches," he pointed toward a cluster of overhanging limbs, "were recently cut back. Not expertly, but deliberately." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the front steps. "And the moss on the stones there is uneven, worn in the middle, thick at the edges. Someone still uses that door." They approached quietly. The front door was a heavy, dark wooden slab with an iron handle and a rusted knocker shaped like a lion's head. The keyhole bore faint scratches, some newer than others. Holmes examined it without touching. "Not forced," he murmured. "Opened with a key, which means someone has access and does not fear being noticed." Miss Marple glanced around. The surrounding land was open, the estate slightly elevated, giving a wide view of the fields and road. "You could see anyone approaching from quite a distance," she observed. "A useful feature if one expected unwelcome visitors." Holmes straightened. "Let us assume, then, that we are unwelcome visitors." He tried the handle. The door protested with a long, low creak, but it opened. The air inside was cold and musty, thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, a faint trace of tobacco, long exhaled, but not entirely gone. They stepped into a wide entrance hall. A grand staircase rose ahead, its banister draped with cobwebs. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dull. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects blurred by grime and age. "It must have been beautiful once," Miss Marple said. "One almost feels sorry for it." Holmes scanned the floor. Thin layers of dust lay across the port. Tiles, except for several distinct tracks. Footprints, some sharply defined, some smudged. "Heavy boots," he noted. "More than one person. Repeated visits." He gestured for Miss Marple to stay close. "We will follow the most recent path. Keep your steps where mine fall if you can." They moved forward, past a collapsed chair and a long mirror, whose silvering had faded into cloudy shadows. The trail led to the right, into what had once been a drawing room. Here, the signs of recent intrusion grew more obvious. A curtain had been pulled aside roughly, tearing at the seam. A long table had been cleared of dust in one broad sweep, as if someone had used it to spread out maps or papers. An empty bottle lay on the floor near the hearth, its label half peeled, and in the fireplace itself, beneath the cold grate, were the faint black remains of burnt paper. Holmes crouched, picking. up a fragile scrap between thumb and forefinger. They were careful, he said, but not perfect. Miss Marple peered at the fragment. Most of it was charred, but a corner remained intact, showing a printed heading. Office of County Survey Records. Land documents, she said, again. Holmes nodded. They brought something here, studied it, destroyed what they did not need. He rose and began to circle the room, eyes sharp. Notice the absence of certain things, Miss Marple. No food tins, no blankets, no lantern left behind. Whoever used this place did so for short visits, never to sleep. Like meeting in a rented room, she mused. A place that belongs to no one and everyone. Holmes paused near a sideboard. On its surface was a faint ring, the mark left by a cup or glass placed too long in one spot. Nearby, a small droplet of dark reddish-brown liquid had dried. Wine? Miss Marple suggested. Possibly, Holmes said. He sniffed it, frowned. Or possibly not. Hard to tell now. The footprints left the drawing-room and split in two directions, one path leading deeper into the house, another toward a side door. Holmes chose the inner path. They followed it to a narrow corridor lined with doors. Most rooms were empty, dust-heavy, and untouched. But near the back of the house, they found a room where the dust had been disturbed in a clear pattern. A large bookcase stood against the far wall. Its contents were sparse, a few old volumes, some scattered papers, and an object that immediately caught Holmes's eye. A folded, stained piece of cloth tucked halfway behind a book. He took it out and spread it flat. It was a handkerchief, once white, now creased and worn. In one corner, embroidered in small, neat stitches, was a set of initials, E.P. Edward Price, Miss Marple said softly. The man buried in the disturbed grave. Holmes nodded. Which suggests that Mr. Edward Price at some point spent time in this house and perhaps was rather more involved in its secrets than his tombstone implies. He examined the shelf more closely. One of the books stood slightly forward compared to the others, its spine less dusty. He tapped it, then pulled. There was a click. The entire bookcase shifted forward a fraction, then slowly, heavily, swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark, narrow space behind it. A lock. Secret passage, Miss Marple whispered. Holmes stepped forward, peering into the darkness. A steep flight of stone steps led downward, disappearing into shadow. The smell rising from below was different, cooler, with a faint hint of damp earth and something metallic. I took the liberty of assuming there would be more to this estate than broken furniture, Holmes said. Miss Marple tightened her shawl. One never likes to be right about such things, but it is rarely pleasant to be wrong either. Holmes glanced at her. You need not descend if you prefer to wait here. Oh, no, Mr. Holmes, she said firmly. If there are answers down there, I have grown far too curious to stay behind. Holmes inclined his head, respecting her resolve. He produced a small pocket lantern from his coat, a compact, clever thing, and lit it. A soft glow filled the narrow passage, pushing back, the dark just enough. Very well, he said. We go together. And side by side, they began to descend into the hidden depths of the Stroud estate. The stone steps were cold beneath their feet, worn in the center by use long past. The walls were rough, beaded with moisture that caught the lantern light in tiny, dull glimmers. The air grew steadily cooler as they descended, and the house above felt more and more distant, like a forgotten dream. Old smugglers' tunnels, perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. I've heard tales of such things along the coast, though we are not particularly near it here. Old tunnels, Holmes agreed, his voice calm in the confined space, often find very modern uses. At the base of the staircase, the passage opened into a low, vaulted cellar. The ceiling was supported by thick beams, and the floor was hard packed earth. Crates, some open, some sealed, were stacked along one wall. A rough wooden table stood in the center, its surface marked by scratches, knife cuts, and faint circular stains. Holmes swept the lantern slowly across the room. On the table lay a few scattered items, a stub of pencil, a scrap of folded paper, and a small tin container. Holmes opened the tin and sniffed. Grease, likely used on machinery, or firearms. Miss Marple's gaze went to the crates. "Do you think?" Holmes was already moving toward them. He pried one open with the tip of his walking stick. Inside, packed in straw, were several metal canisters, cylindrical and plain, each marked with a series of numbers and letters. "Not wine, then," Miss Marple said quietly. Holmes studied the markings. Industrial, military, perhaps. I would need more information to be certain. But whatever they are, they belong neither in an abandoned country estate nor in an innocent village. He turned to the scrap of paper on the table and smoothed it out. It was a roughly sketched diagram, a simple outline of the Stroud estate grounds, with a line drawn from the house to a point near the boundary, marked with a small cross. "Here," he said, pointing. "An exit or an entrance." Miss Marple leaned closer. "Toward the old quarry road." "Exactly," Holmes replied. "A discreet route to bring goods in or send them out without passing through the village proper." Miss Marple's fingers brushed the edge of the paper. "Do you suppose our poor stranger used this tunnel before he came to me?" Holmes considered. If he was carrying information with him, yes, it would be the safest route away from this place. And the men who followed him, he glanced back toward the stairs. They may have come the same way. Miss Marple's eyes traveled around the cellar. They were planning something large then. Supply, secrecy, access to land. It sounds less like common crime and more like strategy. Holmes's expression hardened. Indeed, war has taught certain men that a quiet countryside offers as many advantages as any city. Hidden cash here, a discreet meeting there, all invisible until it is too late. He returned to the table and lifted the small folded paper Miss Marple had first noticed. Inside was a short list, written in tidy, precise handwriting. Stroud confirmed. Quarry road clear. Churchyard secure. Shipment 1 week. Contact G. G for Grayson, Miss Marple suggested. Possibly, Holmes said, or possibly someone even more careful with names. They heard it then. A sound from above. Faint but unmistakable, the creak of a door opening. Footsteps. More than one set. Miss Marple's hand went to her throat. "They're here." Holmes extinguished the lantern in a swift, practiced gesture. The cellar plunged into darkness. "Do not move," he whispered. They waited, listening. The muffled sounds from above grew clearer. Voices, low and indistinct at first, then sharper. As the men descended the stairs above. "Told you we should check the place," one voice said, rough and impatient. "He didn't just vanish into thin air." "And I told you," another replied, smoother, colder, "that drawing attention here would be foolish. But since certain parties could not keep their hands away from a dying man's pockets, we now have no choice." Miss Marple recognized that second tone, controlled, polished, and faintly amused. It was the same voice, she was certain, that had stood at her doorstep and asked about papers in the most courteous way possible. The voice of the man who served a concerned employer. Someone struck a match. Light flared at the top of the cellar steps. Holmes's lips brushed Miss Marple's ear. "Stay behind the crates," he whispered, "and whatever happens, do not reveal yourself unless you must." She resisted the instinct to argue. Survival, she knew, sometimes depended less on courage and more on timing. She slipped silently behind the nearest stack of crates, crouching low, heart beating fast but steady. Holmes, a shadow among shadows, positioned himself near one of the cellar's support beams. 2 men descended. The first was the bowler-hatted messenger from her cottage, his coat neat, his shoes polished, his expression controlled. He carried a lantern. The second man was broader, with a scar along his jaw and a manner that suggested he preferred using fists to words. The scarred man kicked at one of the Tynes 2-tin crates, "Still here," he grunted. "No one's touched anything." "Appearances," the bowler-hatted man replied, "can be deceiving, especially in England." He set the lantern on the table, its light spreading across the room. His gaze swept the cellar, slow, methodical. For a terrible moment, Miss Marple feared it would slide right to where she crouched. It passed over her hiding place and moved on. "Check the passage," he ordered the other man. "If anyone has been here, they might have entered from the house or the road. I want to be sure." The scarred man trudged toward the stairs, grumbling under his breath. The bowler-hatted man remained at the table. He picked up the list Holmes had just read, scanned it, and folded it carefully into his pocket. "Our schedule," he murmured, "so very useful, and so very dangerous in the wrong hands." Holmes shifted slightly, unseen. Miss Marple watched, every sense alert. Then the man spoke again, more softly, almost to himself. "Shipment in 1 week," he said. "Once the estate is fully secured and the final signal arranged from the churchyard. If our informant had not lost his nerve, we would be further along by now." Informant. Miss Marple's blood chilled. "The man who died in my cottage," she thought. "He was one of them who changed his mind." The scarred man returned. "No one in the house. Tracks on the road are old. We're wasting time." "Perhaps," the bowler-hatted man said, "but I would rather waste time than be surprised by clever old women and famous detectives." Holmes's eyes glinted in the dark, though his face remained still. The man took a final, careful look around the cellar, as if committing it to memory. Then he lifted the lantern and gestured toward the stairs. "Come," he said. "We have other arrangements to make. The Stroud estate will serve us well, but only if we remain unseen." Their footsteps receded. The light dimmed and vanished as they ascended. A door closed somewhere above. Silence returned, heavy and trembling. Holmes waited several long seconds before. Relighting the lantern, Miss Marple slowly stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that only shook a little. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose we have our answer." Holmes nodded. "Yes, we know what they intend to use this place for. We know they are cautious, organized, and already suspicious." End quote. A gratitude. He looked at her, his expression grave. "And we know," he added, "that we now have 1 week." Miss Marple drew in a steadying breath. 1 week, she repeated, "to uncover their plan, warn those who must be warned, and prevent whatever wickedness they are hiding beneath our quiet little village." Holmes extinguished the lantern again, leaving only the faint outline of the cellar around them. "Then we shall begin at once," he said. "And, Miss Marple." "Yes, Mr. Holmes." "Let us hope," he murmured, "that the quiet places we have yet to search are not already louder than we think." Together, they began the climb back toward the light, the clock in their minds already ticking toward a danger that had not yet fully revealed its name. Chapter 4. The Grave and the Code. Morning brought no comfort, only a pale light that seemed to make every shadow clearer. Street. Mary Mead looked at first glance, as it always did. Milk bottles on doorsteps, a bicycle propped outside the grocer's, a cat washing itself on a garden wall. But beneath the familiar rhythms, something taut had settled over the village like a thread pulled too tight. Miss Marple felt it in the way people spoke. At the post office, Mrs. Hartley Ridge leaned a little too eagerly across the counter. "Atrocious business, Miss Marple. A dead stranger, police in and out, and I hear Mr. Holmes himself is staying with you. Of course I don't pry, but one does notice things." Miss Marple smiled her most innocent, butter-wouldn't-melt smile. "Oh, my dear, if one noticed fewer things, one might sleep more soundly. A dreadful disadvantage." By the time she returned to her cottage, Sherlock Holmes was waiting with his coat on and hat in hand. "I have confirmed," he said without preamble, "that the crates we saw at the Stroud estate bear markings compatible with industrial or military supplies. I cannot be certain of their contents without opening them, but I doubt they were intended for gardening." Miss Marple hung up her shawl. "No doubt. And our enemies? For The moment, Holmes replied, seem to assume the house is still undisturbed. They are cautious, but not yet alarmed. That gives us a brief advantage. His gaze sharpened. We must use it. Miss Marple nodded. The way forward, I think, lies with the dead. Holmes regarded her thoughtfully. You speak of the stranger. I speak of both of them, she said. Our poor visitor and Edward Price. Men do not have handkerchiefs with their initials found in secret rooms for no reason, and graves do not get disturbed in old churchyards because of idle curiosity. Holmes considered this, then inclined his head. Very well, we shall acquaint ourselves more closely with Mr. Edward Price. The churchyard was quiet when they reached it, the fog thinner now but still clinging around the older stones. A robin hopped along a nearby branch, singing in short, brave bursts. The epitaph on Edward Price's grave looked the same as before. Edward Price, 1873, 1929. Be still and know. Holmes knelt, examining the soil, the stone, the edges of the grave. The disturbance we saw yesterday has not been further altered, he said. Whoever retrieved or buried something here has not returned since. Miss Marple's gaze rested on the inscription. Vicar Ames does not choose such verses at random, she murmured. He is rather fond of relevance. Then we shall ask him, Holmes said, rising. They found the vicar in his study, surrounded by books, a cup of tea growing cold on his desk. He rose at once when they entered. Miss Marple, Mr. Holmes, I had a feeling you would be back. The village is buzzing like a disturbed beehive. We hope not to be the smoke that sends them buzzing, Miss Marple said kindly. Vicar, we've come to ask about Edward Price. The vicar's brows rose. Edward? Good heavens, that's going back a bit. A quiet man, very regular at services, lived alone in one of the cottages near the old road, died in 29 heart trouble, if I recall. Holmes stepped closer. Did he have family? None that I ever met, the vicar replied. He came to the village after the war. Quiet, punctual, rather reserved. One of those men who seems to have a past but doesn't wish to bother anyone with it. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. And his inscription, be still and know. Did he request that himself? The vicar nodded. Yes, he left precise instructions with me. Said he wished to rest where things are quietest. Rather particular about the exact plot as well. Wanted that corner near the U. I remember because it struck me as deliberate. Holmes glanced at Miss Marple. Quietest places, his look seemed to say. Did he hold any particular occupation? Holmes asked. Before he arrived in Street Mary Mead? The vicar tugged at his collar, thinking. He never spoke of it directly, but I believe he worked for the government in some capacity. Once or twice I saw letters addressed from a ministry in Whitehall, Foreign Office, perhaps. He was very interested in Europe, in maps, in, codes actually, puzzles. He liked to donate word squares and cryptograms to the church newsletter. Few could solve them. Holmes's eyes sharpened. A man with experience in codes, who chooses the quietest corner of the churchyard, whose handkerchief is found in a secret room in an estate being used for clandestine activity. He paused. Fascinating. Miss Marple's expression turned thoughtful. Do you still have any of those puzzles, Vicar? His contributions to the newsletter? The vicar brightened. I might. My wife insists I keep copies of everything we print. For history, she says. Let me see. He rummaged in a cabinet, then produced a small stack of yellowing papers. Miss Marple and Holmes examined them together. On one page was a simple substitution cipher, letters replaced with numbers. On another, A, phrase concealed by the first letters of each word in a seemingly ordinary paragraph. On yet another, a grid of letters, some circled, forming a hidden sentence when read in the correct order. Holmes studied them with keen interest. Elegant, he said. Simple, but suggestive of a mind that enjoys concealment. Miss Marple traced a finger along one particular puzzle, where the solution was printed underneath in the vicar's handwritten note. Truth is safest where it is least noticed. She read it aloud. Holmes smiled faintly. It appears Mr. Price and our unfortunate visitor would have got on well. Or not well at all, Miss Marple replied. Two men who understand secrets may trust no one, not even each other. Holmes folded one of the newsletters carefully. Vicar, may we borrow these? They may provide a key to something considerably larger than a church. Newsletter. By all means, the vicar said. If they help you, take whatever you need, though I never thought Edward's little games would be of interest to anyone outside our parish. They may be of immense interest, Holmes said quietly, perhaps even fatal. As they left the vicarage, Miss Marple spoke in a low voice. Do you think Edward Price was one of them, Mr. Holmes? Or one of us? A fair question, Holmes replied. He might have once served in some confidential capacity, retired here, and brought certain habits with him. It is entirely possible that after his death, someone who knew of his past repurposed his resting place for new secrets. Or he left something behind deliberately, Miss Marple finished, for the right person to find, or the wrong one. Holmes nodded. Exactly. They paused at the edge of the churchyard, the wind rustling through the yew branches. The grave, Miss Marple said slowly, may not be the only thing he left for us. Holmes tapped the folded newsletters against his hand. No, if I am not mistaken, Edward Price has given us something far more valuable than bones under stone. Miss Marple looked at him. A language. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Yes, a language with which to interpret our stranger's final message, and perhaps the plans of those who now walk in his shadow. They turned back toward her cottage. Behind them, the grave of Edward Price lay still and quiet. But neither of them now believed for a moment that he was truly at rest. Back at Miss Marple's cottage, the day dimmed into a grey, indecisive afternoon. The fire crackled softly in the grate, and the ticking of the clock seemed unusually loud. On the small oak table between them lay a curious array. The stranger's note, "The truth lies beneath the quietest places," the borrowed newsletters containing Edward Price's puzzles, a sheet of clean paper, a pencil sharpened to a fine point. Miss Marple poured tea. Holmes did not seem to notice. His full attention was on the patterns before him. We must first assume, he said, that our stranger was connected in some way to the same network that once included Edward Price. Miss Marple nodded. He knew to seek out a quiet village, a quiet old woman, and use a quiet sentence that seems very loud upon examination. Precisely, Holmes said. Men in such circles often develop their own shared habits, a way of writing, a choice of phrase. Edward Price's puzzles may reveal that habit. He spread the newsletters out, marking certain sections with the pencil. Observe here, he said. In this acrostic puzzle, the phrase, "Be still and know" is hidden by using the first letter of every third word in the text. In this other one, he uses an apparently innocent sentence about the church roof to conceal coordinates in the numbers of the hymn references. Miss Marple tilted her head. He favored the quiet parts of a text then. The corners, the thirds, the places people don't look closely. Holmes nodded. Now, consider the phrase, "the quietest places." What does that suggest to you structurally? She thought. Corners, margins, footnotes, the ends of things? Or, Holmes added, the places least likely to draw attention. In a village that could be a disused estate, a forgotten grave, an old library record. In writing, it could be the smallest letters, the least noticeable pattern. He drew the stranger's sentence in large letters on the clean paper. The truth lies beneath the quietest places. Edward Price liked acrostics, Holmes murmured. He circled the first letters of the words, TTLBTQP. Unhelpful, he said, unless one is fond of meaningless consonant clusters. He tried the last letters, EHSHETS. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you might consider that Edward Price had a rather churchy mind. He used verses, he used hymns, He chose his grave for its location. Quietest places in a village might correspond to quietest lines in a text. Holmes paused. Quietest lines? Yes, she said. Lines no one reads. The note is only one line. But what if it is not just a sentence, but a pointer to another text entirely? Holmes's eyes narrowed. He looked again at the church newsletter where Edward had once hidden a message in a hymn listing. Vicar, said Edward, chose his epitaph himself. Miss Marple continued, Be still and know. That is from a particular placeless Arpia's psalm, if I'm not mistaken. Holmes's mind moved quickly. Psalm 46, verse 10. She smiled faintly. You see, Mr. Holmes, even an old woman who never went to university may have a decent memory for things she's heard in church 1,000 times. Holmes rose. And the stranger, if he knew Edward's habits, might be directing us to look not only at quiet places in the village, but also quiet verses in a book both men assumed their allies would know. He moved to Miss Marple's small bookshelf and scanned it. As expected, there was a well-worn Bible, its spine cracked from long use. He brought it back to the table, opened it, and turned to the Psalms. Psalm 46, he murmured. Let us see what Edward Price might have considered beneath the quietest places. He counted down the lines, reading silently. Miss Marple watched his eyes move, quick and focused. There, he said at B. Last. He turned the book toward her and tapped the margin beside verse 10, where someone had made a tiny, almost imperceptible pencil mark, long faded but visible in the right light. Be still and know that I am God, Miss Marple read softly. Below it, in even smaller script, almost invisible against the old paper, were 4 initials, E, P, and, next to them, G, L. G, L, Holmes repeated. Grayson, or another name entirely. He flipped to the back of the Bible, where some people wrote births and deaths. There, on the inner cover, in the same faint pencil, was a short note. Quiet places. Grave, library, estate, road. Signal from the church. Key in the psalm numbers. Miss Marple drew in a quiet breath. Edward's map. Not of streets, Holmes said, but of meaning. He believed, perhaps, that one day someone would need to understand what he had helped build, or what he regretted building. He scanned the note again. Grave, library, estate, road, all connected. We have seen them all now. Stroud estate at the edge, library records already tampered with, grave disturbed. Road by the quarry used as a discreet route. And signal from the church, Miss Marple repeated. That must be what the bowler-hatted man referred to when he mentioned arranging a signal from the churchyard for the shipment. Holmes nodded slowly. Most likely a visual sign, a lantern perhaps, or a pattern of bells, something that can be seen or heard from the road, and possibly from the estate, but would seem harmless to villagers. Miss Marple tapped the note with a careful finger. And key in the psalm numbers? Holmes thought. If we took the numbers of certain psalms commonly used here, or chosen by Edward, they might correspond to dates, times, or even positions on a map. He turned back to the newsletters. One corner bore a small notice from years ago. Special service, Psalm 24, 46, and 91. These 3 again, he murmured. 24, 46, 91. Perhaps 24th hour? No, we use 24-hour time rarely in daily life here. More likely, 4th day, 6th hour, 9th day, or coordinates. Miss Marple's gaze grew distant, remembering something. The vicar mentioned once, years ago now, that Edward Price seemed very interested in which psalms were chosen for which occasions. He even suggested some. She hesitated, and he once said, jokingly, that if one knew which hymn was sung, one always knew where everyone would be and when. Holmes's eyes brightened. Of course, church attendance is a timetable. If you know which service they will use as cover, you know when villagers will be in the church and when the roads and fields outside will be quietest. He closed the Bible gently, as if sealing an understanding. So, he said, our enemies are planning a shipment in 1 week. They will use the Stroud estate as a receiving point. They will coordinate via a signal from the churchyard, perhaps during or just after a service whose psalm selection corresponds to their timing. They rely on the village's own schedule of devotion to cloak their movements. Miss Marple sat very still. And we now hold the key to their pattern. Holmes looked at her. We must attend every service between now and the end of the week. We must watch the roads, the churchyard, the path to Stroud, quietly. If we move too boldly, we will warn them. If we do too little, we risk being too late. Miss Marple gave a small, firm nod. Then we shall sit in the pews like dutiful parishioners and listen to the psalms. I expect I shall appear particularly pious. Holmes allowed himself a brief smile. I have no doubt you will convince them all. The candle on the table flickered as a draught moved through the room. Shadows shifted along the walls. Miss Marple looked down at the stranger's note one more time. The truth lies beneath the quietest places. It seems, she said softly, that our quiet little village is not quiet at all. It is simply being used as a whisper when others expect a shout. Holmes's gaze went to the window, where the fading light made the lane look oddly uncertain. And whispers, he said, can be the most dangerous sounds of all. Between them, the Bible, the puzzles, and the note lay like pieces of a completed thought. Outside, the bell of St. Mary Mead Church chimed the hour, a small, familiar sound. But to two people in a candle-lit room, it no longer sounded simple at all. Chapter 5. The Signal in the Churchyard. The next days in St. Mary Mead passed with a peculiar blend of normality and hidden urgency. To the casual eye, nothing had changed. Children still skipped along the lane. Mrs. Hartley Ridge still shouted after the butcher's boy for short-weighted cuts, and the vicar still cycled carefully over the cobbles with his cassock half tucked under him. But to Miss Marple and Sherlock Holmes, every small detail had become part of a larger, ticking mechanism. They began, as planned, with the church. On Wednesday evening, the Prod de Blaise kind midweek service attracted only a modest number of villagers. Miss Marple, sitting in her usual pew, felt the familiar hush settle over the nave as the candles were lit and the organist's thin attempts at a hymn drifted into the rafters. Holmes sat beside her, head bowed just enough to appear devout, eyes half lowered but never idle. When the vicar announced, "We shall now read from Psalm 91, Miss Marple's hands tightened slightly around her prayer book. Psalm 24, 46, 91, Holmes had said. The old pattern. As Reverend Ames read, Holmes's gaze slid subtly toward the front side aisle windows. Through the coloured panes, he could see the faint silhouettes of the churchyard yew, the gravestones, and just for an instant, the soft flare of a match. He did not move. Neither did Miss Marple. After the service, villagers drifted out in their usual slow, chatty trickle. Mrs. Ames discussed flowers for Sunday. Mrs. Hartley Ridge offered critiques of the organist. Two teenagers slouched at the back, pretending they hadn't been made to come. Holmes and Miss Marple moved more slowly, allowing the crowd to thin. "Did you see it?" Holmes murmured as they stepped into the cool evening air. "By the yew," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Someone lit a cigarette during Psalm 91. Holmes nodded. More precisely, someone lit two matches, one quickly extinguished, the second used. A small thing, unless one believes he meant to be seen. They paused, as if inspecting the roses along the church path. To any onlooker, they were simply lingering, but their eyes searched. Near the far side of the yard, under the shadow of the old yew tree, a man in a dark coat leaned against the wall, apparently quite casual. He dropped the end of his cigarette, ground, tin it out with his heel, and strolled away toward the lane without a backward glance. "That is not our bowler-hatted friend," Miss Marple observed. "No," Holmes said, "too careless by half. He is the sort of man one hires for simple signals, not decisions." They did not follow him. Not yet. Instead, They filed the moment away, one small note in a growing symphony. The next day, Holmes made quiet inquiries in the village about new arrivals. He learned that the man seen by the U was lodging in a room above the pub, claiming to be a travelling salesman for farming tools. No one had seen him produce a single tool. On Friday, they attended another short service. This time, the vicar read Psalm 24. Outside, no matches flared, no shadows moved unusually. The churchyard was still. Holmes did not look disappointed. "Not every occurrence will be meaningful," he said, "but we, now, know they are willing to use the church services for their pattern. They are watching and waiting just as we are." That evening they spread their notes again across Miss Marple's table. "We have 1 week from the discovery at Stroud," Holmes said quietly. "By my estimation, the shipment could arrive any day from Saturday onward. If they are practical, they will choose a time when villagers are most occupied and the roads emptiest." "Sunday evening," Miss Marple said at once. "People are tired after the day's meals and visits. They stay home. The roads are quiet, and yet a Sunday evening service, even a short one, would give them a ready-made signal opportunity." Holmes's eyes warmed with approval. "Just so. We must watch Sunday most carefully." "Will you warn Scotland Yard?" she asked. "I already have," he replied. "A discreet inspector and a small group of used plain-clothes men will be positioned near the old quarry road on Sunday, out of sight. But they cannot move too soon. If our adversaries sense a trap, they may vanish and take their secrets with them." Miss Marple looked at the Bible lying open beside the teapot. "Truth is safest where it is, least noticed," she quoted. "We shall have to behave very much like truth then." Sunday came, bright and deceptively peaceful. The morning service passed without incident. There were the usual hymns, the same handful of villagers who sang loudly and off-key, and a collection plate that never quite filled to the vicar's hopeful expectation. Miss Marple and Holmes behaved as if nothing in the world were more important than the sermon. It was the evening service that mattered. The sky had turned the colour of fading embers when the bells called the faithful once more. Holmes and Miss Marple walked side by side up the church path, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on their backs. "The churchyard will be watched," Holmes murmured. "We must assume our movements are noted." "Then let us give them something unalarming to note," Miss Marple replied. "An old woman and her guest, going to pray." Inside, the candles glowed softly. The congregation was smaller than in the morning, a handful of regulars, a few old ladies, and a drowsy farmer who looked as though he might fall asleep mid-hymn. Reverend Ames opened his Bible, glanced at his notes, and then smiled faintly. "For this evening," he announced, "I find it fitting that we return to a passage which has long brought comfort in times of trouble, Psalm 46. Miss Marple felt, for the first time in a long while, a true chill that had nothing to do with drafts. Beside her, she sensed Holmes become absolutely still. Psalm 46. Be still and know. The psalm of Edward Price, the psalm of the marked grave, the psalm that had given them their key. The vicar's voice rose gently through the nave, steady and clear. Outside, through the narrowed view of the stained glass windows, the sky finally gave itself over to dusk. Holmes leaned slightly closer to Miss Marple. "When the reading ends," he whispered, "do not look toward the yard. They will expect it. Leave that to me." She inclined her head the tiniest fraction. The psalm ended. There was a rustle of movement as people settled, turned pages, prepared for the hymn. Holmes bowed his head as if in silent prayer, but behind half-lowered lids, his sharp gaze slipped sideways, tracking the flickers of candlelight and the movement of shadows beyond the glass. There, by the yew, a brief flash, one match, then another. This time not for a cigarette, but held deliberately at a particular height, in a sequence. 1, 2, pause, 1. A pattern. Holmes's mind recorded it instantly. After the service, as villagers moved slowly toward the door, Miss Marple and Holmes did not hurry. They exchanged a few polite remarks, shook hands where expected, and finally stepped out into the cool air of the churchyard. The yew tree loomed as it always had, but the men who had lit the signal were already gone. "They take care not to linger," Miss Marple said quietly. "Of course," Holmes replied. "The signal is not for those already here. It is for those watching from afar, from Stroud, or from the road." Miss Marple's gaze travelled across the graves, resting momentarily on Edward Price's stone. "Then, tonight," she murmured, the whisper becomes a movement. Holmes looked toward the darkening lane, leading out of the village, toward the invisible road beyond. "Yes," he said, "and we must be there to hear it." The fog rolled in late that night, as if summoned. It began as a faint, silvery veil along the hedgerows, then thickened silently until the village seemed to float in a world of its own. Lamps became hazy halos, windows soft squares of diluted light, footsteps muted on the damp ground. Miss Marple stood at her window, the candle at her side burning steadily. Behind her, Holmes checked his watch. "By my calculation," he said, "they will need at least an hour after the signal to position themselves. The Stroud estate is close enough that they could move quickly, but a shipment requires coordination. Horses or a motor car, crates, men. They will prefer the road by the quarry, fewer chances of being seen." "And Scotland Yard?" Miss Marple asked. "Will be in place," Holmes replied. "Close enough to act, far enough not to scare our quarry away." Miss Marple wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "And us?" Holmes's mouth curved slightly. "We, Miss Marple, shall take a walk. An innocent, late-night, thoroughly foolish walk, as only an elderly lady and her rather eccentric guest might choose to take." She gave a quiet laugh. "You have met me very briefly, Mr. Holmes, but you already understand me alarmingly well." They stepped out into the fog together. The village was almost entirely asleep now. Curtains were drawn. Only the faintest hints of lamplight escaped. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then thought better of it. Holmes and Miss Marple walked as though they had all the time in the world, choosing a path that would seem unthreatening, past the post office, past the vicarage, then gradually angling toward the outer lane that led, eventually, to the old quarry road. As they neared the edge of the village, Holmes's posture changed almost imperceptibly, shoulders a fraction tenser, head turned slightly to catch more sound. "2 men behind us," he murmured softly, one on each side of the lane, keeping of their distance. "They do not yet know whether we are merely eccentric or inconvenient." "Let us give them the benefit of doubt," Miss Marple replied. "I should hate to make their work seem easy." They reached a small crossroads, where a narrow path split off toward the churchyard's far boundary. "Here," Holmes said quietly, "we part company for appearance's sake only. I shall move ahead along the main road. You will turn toward the churchyard, and, after a short pause, continue toward the vicarage, as though you have thought better of a long walk." Miss Marple's eyes glinted in the mist. "And what do you hope this will accomplish?" "If they follow me," Holmes said, "they reveal where they wish to be. If they do not, it means they have business nearer the church, in which case you, Miss Marple, may observe more than any man in this village believes you capable of observing. And if they choose to watch us both?" "Then," Holmes replied, "we have confirmed beyond doubt that we are the most interesting people in Street Mary Mead, which I already suspected." She smiled. "Go on then. I shall do my best to look like nothing more than a foolish old woman who has forgotten why she came out." Holmes tipped his hat and moved away into the fog, his figure soon swallowed by it. Miss Marple turned toward the darker path along the churchyard wall. She walked slowly, letting her cane tap lightly against the stones. Inwardly, she counted to 20, giving Holmes time to draw attention if any was to be drawn. Then she stopped beside a small gap in the hedge, where one could peer through into the churchyard. The yew tree stood black against the paler mist. For a few moments, nothing moved. Then she saw it. A brief, hooded light, not from the church, but from the far side of the yard, nearer the gravestones. A lantern, quickly covered, then revealed again. 1, 2, pause, 1. the same pattern Holmes had seen through the window. Miss Marple's breath shallowed. She shifted slightly, angling herself to see more. A dark figure stood near Edward Price's grave, his back to her. Another figure moved at the edge of the yard, closer to the road, a watcher, perhaps, confirming that the signal had been seen. When the lantern flickered for the final time, a faint, distant sound reached Miss Marple's ears, the low rumble of a motor car, muffled by fog, somewhere along the quarry road path. The shipment, she thought. The lantern was extinguished. The man near the grave knelt briefly, whether to check the earth or conceal something she could not see. The watcher at the boundary gave a soft whistle, and both figures melted into the mist, heading toward the outer gate. Miss Marple did not move until they were gone. Then she turned, calmly, and walked back toward the vicarage lane, as if nothing had happened. Holmes found her a short while later, near the vicarage gate, where she stood admiring the roses in the dark. They went toward the road, she said quietly. Signal from the graveyard, near Edward Price's stone. Lantern pattern. 2 men. The car is on the move. Good, Holmes replied. Our friends from Scotland Yard have already seen it. He glanced toward the vague direction of the quarry. They will not. Act immediately better to catch them in the act of unloading. Crates on the ground, hands upon them, no excuses. And us? Miss Marple asked. Holmes's gaze returned to the churchyard. We go back to where the signal came from, the grave. Whatever they checked or moved there tonight may tell us how close they are to finishing their preparations. They slipped back through the hedge gap and into the churchyard, moving with a quietness that seemed almost natural amid the old stones. The earth near Edward Price's grave was disturbed again. Holmes knelt, feeling along the edges of the cows. Freshly tamped soil. His fingers encountered something thin and hard just beneath the surface. With controlled urgency, he dug gently until he uncovered a small metal box, no larger than a prayer book. It had been buried shallowly, meant to be retrieved quickly. Holmes lifted it free. Left. To be taken tonight, he said softly. But our conspirators were slightly delayed. Police and crates are very distracting, Miss Marple replied. Even for clever men. Holmes opened the box. Inside was a folded sheet of paper and a small, compact device of metal and wheels, a code machine of some kind, portable and precise. Holmes unfolded the paper and scanned it. Even in the faint light, the words were clear enough to read. Final arrangement confirmed. Stroud will receive shipment for redistribution. Signals via Church and Quarry Road shall continue for 3 nights only. Then move inland. No further use of village. Loose ends to be removed. Miss Marple's throat tightened at the last line. Loose ends, she echoed. They mean witnesses. Holmes's jaw set. Or traitors, our poor stranger among them, and perhaps anyone else they suspect of knowing too much. He refolded the paper and slipped it, and the small device, into his pocket. Tonight, he said, the yard will take their shipment. By morning, this estate, this road, and these men will not be so free to move. But we must assume that others in their circle will not simply accept defeat. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the silent graves, and they may believe that you, Mr. Holmes, and I, are very much loose ends indeed. Holmes looked at her with a respect that had deepened from their first meeting. Then we must ensure, he said, that loose ends are tied before they are cut. From far off, through the muffling fog, came the faint, sharp echo of shouted commands, men's voices raised in alarm, the grinding halt of wheels, the metallic clatter of something heavy dropped and seized, the law making itself heard at last. Miss Marple and Holmes stood for a moment beside Edward. Price's grave, its epitaph, "Be still and know," now carrying a weight of meaning none of the other villagers would ever suspect. Edward Price played a long game, Miss Marple murmured, perhaps longer than even he imagined. Holmes nodded. And our stranger gave his life to pass us the final peace. They turned back toward the village, walking slowly along the church path. The bell did not ring, but in the quiet, every small sound, their footsteps, the rustle of the yew, the distant echo of the fog-muted arrest, seemed full of consequence. "Tomorrow," Miss Marple said softly, "Street. Mary Mead will wake up and talk about an unusual disturbance on the far road. They will wonder and they will invent, but they will not know." "Nor should they," Holmes replied. "The safest truth for most people is the one they never have to carry." He glanced sideways at her, a rare warmth in his eyes. "But some," he added, "bear it rather well." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "One does one's best, Mr. Holmes, even in the quietest places." They disappeared into the mist, leaving behind a churchyard where secrets had finally begun to surface, and where, beneath the stone of a quiet man's grave, the first light of understanding had been struck. Chapter 6. The Web Tightens. Morning arrived slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the fog that still clung to Street Mary Mead like a half-forgotten whisper. The village awoke, buzzing with rumours. A motor-car crashed by. The quarry road, distant shouts in the night, the sense that something had happened. In Miss Marple's cottage, Sherlock Holmes sat with a cup of tea he did not drink, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "The Yard intercepted the shipment," he said. "3 men taken into custody, crates secured, one of them injured while attempting to flee. The rest are being questioned." Miss Marple stirred sugar into her tea. "And the mastermind?" Holmes shook his head. "Gone, or rather, not yet arrived. These men were agents, nothing more, carrying out instructions from someone higher, someone more careful. Ibe, Lesmond, I." Miss Marple's fingers paused on the teacup. "The bowler-hatted gentleman." "Precisely." Holmes stood and approached the window. He would not be with the shipment. He would oversee from a distance, the type to supervise signals, issue instructions, and ensure his less clever associates take the fall. "And now," Miss Marple murmured, "he will know something has gone terribly wrong." Holmes gave a thin smile. "Which means he will make a mistake. Even cautious men panic when their plans collapse." As if on cue, there came a soft rap at the door. Miss Marple looked up. "Not the vicar, surely?" Holmes motioned her aside and approached silently, pausing just long enough to angle himself away from direct line of sight. Only then did he open the door. Standing on the threshold was Inspector Graves, looking harried, breathless, and very out of sorts. "Mr. Holmes, Miss Marple, I require your assistance at once. Terrible business. One of the prisoners escaped. The one with the scar on his jaw overpowered a constable and fled into the fields. Scotland Yard is in pursuit, but—" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Inspector Graves, when did this happen?" "Barely 20 minutes ago," Graves said, mopping his brow. "We have men everywhere." "Ah, dreadful, simply dreadful." Holmes watched him for exactly 4 seconds. Then he said, very evenly, "Inspector Graves would not run. He would walk. He would not speak so loudly. And he would most certainly not misplace a dangerous prisoner without sending word ahead by official dispatch." The fake Inspector Graves froze. Miss Marple gasped softly, but with perfect composure. Holmes stepped forward, blocking the door from closing. "Your imitation," he added coolly, "is clever enough to fool a stranger. But regrettably, for you, I am not one." The man's shoulders slumped. The bowler-hatted messenger straightened from behind the disguise, removing a fake moustache, wiping away the smudged soot on his cheek. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, smiling thinly, "it would have been disappointing if you had not noticed." 2 men stepped out from the fog behind him, one on each side of the door. Holmes's eyes flicked once to Miss Marple. "It seems," she said gently, "we are the loose ends." "Indeed," the bowler-hatted man replied. "You meddled where you were not invited, and our employer dislikes meddling, especially from the elderly and the overconfident." Holmes's voice dropped. "Your employer, Grayson, or someone above him?" The man's smile widened. "Names are so unnecessary at this point." Holmes shifted his stance subtly, a movement only Miss Marple noticed. She understood instantly. He meant to stall, to buy time. "Tell me," Miss Marple said in her calmest tone, "why you left a code machine in a graveyard. That does seem rather careless." "It worked." The man bristled. "Careless? That device was to be retrieved tonight, not intercepted by an old woman creeping through. Headstones like a cat." "Technically," Holmes murmured, "I retrieved it." "And incorrectly," the man snapped. "You forced our timetable. Now everything must be—" A shout cut him off. "Stop, police!" The bowler-hatted man spun around too late. Inspector Graves, the real one, and 3 yard officers burst through the fog from behind the cottage garden. Holmes moved in the same instant, seizing the fake inspector by the arm and twisting it sharply behind him. The man cried out and stumbled forward, colliding with one officer. The other 2 men turned to flee, but yardmen were already blocking the lane. It was over in seconds. Holmes dusted off his coat. "You took rather a long time, Inspector." Graves flushed. "My apologies, sir. That fellow attempted to impersonate me at the station. We realized the trick only when one of my sergeants noticed the impostor had polished boots." "I never polish boots." Miss Marple hid a smile. Holmes stepped back into the cottage with her, the officers dragging the 3 captured men away toward the village station. Inside, Holmes exhaled deeply. "That was unexpectedly dramatic." "Quite," Miss Marple agreed primly, "but hardly our last concern." Holmes turned toward her. "Miss Marple, may I say, your intervention at the correct moment was invaluable." She patted his arm lightly. "One grows accustomed to reading people and saving foolish men from themselves." Holmes almost laughed. Almost. By late afternoon, the fog had begun to lift. Street Mary Mead's houses emerged from the haze like returning ships, their chimneys sending up thin plumes of smoke. Holmes and Miss Marple walked slowly toward the vicarage, summoned by Reverend Ames for urgent church records business, a transparent excuse, but a polite one. When they entered his study, the vicar closed the door at once. "Miss Marple, Mr. Holmes, I must speak with you about Edward Price." Holmes stiffened. Miss Marple folded her hands. "What about him?" she asked. "He left something with me," the vicar confessed, lowering his epophet voice. "Long ago, with instructions that it should be opened only when the quiet places grow loud. I never understood what he meant." He produced a small envelope. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a note, written in the same neat script as the puzzles. "If this is found, I have failed to stop what I helped build. Watch the church. Watch the estate. Do not trust those who come from the city. And if necessary, burn this village quiet again. E.P." Miss Marple's breath caught. Holmes stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it and returned it to its envelope. "He wanted to bury the truth," Holmes said quietly, "but instead he hid it too well, and others found a use for it." The vicar looked shaken. "What happens now?" Holmes answered first. "Now the yard will dismantle the operation at Stroud. They will trace the crates, question the walled men, and identify the mastermind. But they will not publicize Edward Price's involvement, nor the stranger's, nor yours, Miss Marple." He turned to her fully. "For the sake of the village and for the sake of peace, this conspiracy must die quietly." Miss Marple nodded. "Some truths are too heavy for hearth and garden." Holmes looked toward the church window, where the sunlight filtered through stained glass. "You understand, Miss Marple," he said gently, "that the world will never know what happened here." She smiled. "Most of the world would not believe me if I told it." A soft silence fell. The vicar excused himself, flustered and grateful. Holmes and Miss Marple stepped back into the fading afternoon. They walked without speaking until they reached the gate of her cottage. At last Holmes said, "I have worked with many minds, some brilliant, some reckless, some extraordinarily difficult. But yours, Miss Marple, is rare." She looked genuinely touched. "You are very kind, Mr. Holmes." Holmes adjusted his coat. "I believe we shall meet again." "I do hope so," she said warmly. Holmes paused, then added, with a trace of humour, "Should trouble arise in another quiet corner of England, I shall expect you to have solved half of it before I arrive." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "I shall try to leave you some clues, if only for your pride." For the first time since arriving in Street Mary Mead, Sherlock Holmes laughed. He tipped his hat, turned, and walked down the lane, tall, confident, fading into the last wisps of lingering fog. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression thoughtful, fond, and resolute. Then she stepped inside, closed her door, and placed Edward Price's puzzles back into their drawer. Her village was quiet again. But she knew better than anyone. Quiet was never the absence of secrets, only the space between them. In the gentle hush of Street Mary Mead, life slowly slipped back into its familiar rhythm. The fog lifted, the lanes brightened, and the villagers resumed their quiet routines, unaware of how close danger had come. Only Miss Marple carried the weight of the secret beneath her calm smile. She tended her garden, poured her tea, and listened to the village chatter with renewed fondness, understanding now, more than ever, the fragile peace hidden in small places. Sherlock Holmes had long since departed, his silhouette fading into the horizon like a final whispered clue. But the echo of their unlikely partnership lingered in her thoughts, warm and sharp at once. The truth had been found, the danger extinguished, and the quiet restored. And yet, as Miss Marple blew out her candle, that night she knew this. Quiet villages hold the loudest mysteries, and she would be ready for the next.